All right. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It's nice to be back after missing 3 weeks of Torah study, which is very sad. And I'm going to miss next week, so you're going to have to do the end of Leviticus without me too, which is very sad. But I'm glad I made it back in time for a little bit of Leviticus. So we are starting in Leviticus 21. Only one portion. I don't even get a double portion. There's 3 double portions in Leviticus.
Yeah, you missed last week.
And I don't even... Miguel got 2 of them. Miguel had 2 double portions in a row. And I don't know who's teaching next week, actually. I don't remember. I don't know if we have anybody. Maybe we'll find someone. We will find someone. I just don't remember if there's anybody on the schedule.
That's one off the street.
So yes. So I haven't even gotten to hear all the watch the videos. There wasn't a live stream one week, I think, but I haven't gotten to go back and watch. So I don't know everything that you guys have talked about, but I'm sure it has been lively and exciting discussion, right? I mean, you got the high point of the Torah last week, I think it was, with Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement. I was reading that portion, and then we went on a tour of the Jewish quarter of Prague that day, the day that I read that portion, so that was kind of fun. But anyway, so we are nearing the end of Leviticus. One of the things I like about this portion is that it's a really good one for seeing how this book is structured in all these parallel levels. If you remember, I have a few extra copies over there if you want one. This diagram. They're up on this table if you want one. I don't know how many copies were there. I just brought what I had left. But this one does a good job of showing how this portion parallels the previous portion of Leviticus. So we're starting in 21, and 21 and 22 kind of parallel 8 through 10, and it's kind of fun to see some of those. So we'll kind of go through a few of those as we go through. But we are in this section of Leviticus that is more focused on holiness. We talked about kind of the first half of the first sort of half of Leviticus is kind of about blood. Lots of things about the sacrifices, lots of things about just about the rituals that are involved with the tabernacle and things like that. And then the second half transitions at the turning point is the Day of Atonement. And then we kind of move into holiness. And so when I get to this section or this second part of Leviticus, it always just really stands out to me. Holiness, of course, but just it makes me think about like what does that mean and what does that look like and how do we and of course we're always kind of like trying to figure out like this system with the tabernacle and the sacrificial system and all of that is so different than what we're used to and so different than their world was so different than the world that we live in. So how do we take some of these principles and how do they inform how we interact with the Lord and with each other now? So I kind of want to talk mainly just about holiness today, I think, as we go through the portion. And we kind of have, I would say, 3 main sections to this portion. The first one is in chapter 21 and 22 is kind of it reiterates some of the holiness code, the instructions for the priests specifically. And then it moves into this section about the feasts, and then in 23, and then 24 ends with a couple of really interesting things. It has this short little section about the light, the menorah, and the bread in the tabernacle. And then it has this little story, this little narrative about someone who blasphemes the name of the Lord. And we'll talk about that. That'll be interesting to talk about when we get there. But just as kind of to show you my point about seeing the parallels, if we were to flip back to 8 through 10, chapter 8 is the consecration of the priests, right? Which if we're looking at this blood and holiness paradigm, one of the things that comes up with the consecration of the priests is that they have blood applied to them, right? Which is very interesting. This is the section that has, there's blood on the altar, and I believe this is also when also like on Aaron, they put some of the blood of the sacrifice on his ear and his hand and his toe, which is very interesting. There's blood sprinkled on the people. I don't know if that's actually in this section or if it's somewhere else, but it's part of it. And then the priests kind of, in chapter 9, the priests kind of begin their ministry. And then chapter 10 ends with Aaron's sons offering unauthorized fire and all of the consequences of that. So especially when it comes to the priests and this kind of what I would call a rebellion, you definitely see the parallels there. So it's just an interesting how that structure plays out. So I think one of the things, like, when we think about holiness, it's kind of like we have to think about, like, how do we define holiness? And I'll let some people give some ideas about that. Yeah.
Set apart for sacred use.
Okay.
Which would include, staying away from sin, but just that basic definition includes the fact that the Sabbath was made holy even before sin was brought into the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good. What else? Everybody's going to give the same definition?
How do us mortal humans attain holiness?
Yeah.
And walk in that 24/7?
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible?
Is it possible? That's a good question.
My answer is yes, no.
Yes, no.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I guess we can contrast it to the ordinary,
Mm-hmm.
the mundane, like
Yep.
6 days of the week are not sin, they're not evil.
Right.
They're just regular days.
Right. Exactly.
And then, like Marshall said, the seventh day is set apart as separate.
Mm-hmm.
And the tabernacle was set apart as a special place to be with God.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we're talking about in 23 the different festivals.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to use an analogy of like you work in an office and you have a boss that has an open door policy. So you can walk in there anytime. In the ordinary day, you can walk in and see the boss.
Mm-hmm.
But he does have set times when he wants to meet with everybody
Right.
that he supervises.
Yeah. That's
So
good.
those are holy
Yeah.
meetings.
Yeah. That's a good analogy. And also, like, when you walk in, at least when I worked in office, like, you tend to when you walk into your boss's office, you don't, depending on your relationship with your boss, I guess, you there's a way that you approach, right? You approach respectfully and you whatever. So you think about it when you walk into their office, which I also think is important. Yeah.
Ms. Emma, not necessarily now, but sometime before class ends, could you comment on, like in the Lord's Prayer where God says, and my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the actual literal translation is our Father who art in heaven, who sanctifies his name, or let his name be sanctified.
Mm-hmm.
Like comment, because it seems like his name would always be sanctified. So I think, I'd like more understanding of what that actually means. Not necessarily now, but just sometime before the end of class. Okay.
Yeah, I think that might tie in with some of the things that'll come up a little bit later. So yeah, we'll get there. So what is so if holiness is to be set apart, it's in contrast to, like we were saying, the different translations phrase it differently. The common, the secular, the everyday. Which again, those things are not necessarily sinful. Like 6 days of the week are not evil inherently, and then one day holy. It's just different, right? There's a contrast. So, and I think the same is true we could apply that same thing to other things, or that same idea to other things. But so if this holiness is this set apart, this other than, so to speak, what is the goal of it? Yeah.
Well, I was going to say holiness is also the opposite of wickedness, the opposite of sinfulness.
Sure.
So if God wants to have fellowship with us, he's found a way to make us holy as he also is holy.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say it's more than different.
Yeah.
There's a purity that is the goal.
Yes. Yes. So purity is a goal. What are some other goals or purposes of holiness? Why do we care so much about being holy?
I think purity being the goal then allows us to be with him,
Mm-hmm.
to have that fellowship on even a greater level.
Yeah,
so to speak. Yeah.
for sure.
Well, I would also say, because the enemy's goal is to steal, kill, and destroy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also to pull us away from that influence that would ultimately destroy us.
Yeah.
And separate us from God.
Yeah.
Forever.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
I was going to say we're also called to walk in truth and righteousness as well,
Yes.
and in the light.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so it's this holiness, and I think this is important to keep in mind. So holiness is kind of this, the goal of it is like union and fellowship with the Lord, right? And the flip side of it, the other way to say that is to not be drawn away by the evil one into death and destruction and all these things, like Faith was mentioning. But I think it's important to keep that in mind, because I think that's what can keep us from thinking that we're holy when we're really just being, I don't know, legalistic or rule followers. And I'm kind of a rule follower in life. And so, I mean, but there's also times when I'm like, I don't understand why this is a rule, so I don't want to follow it. But so holiness is about being with the Lord. And so if the motivation behind following all these instructions is something other than drawing closer to the Lord, then we're missing something and we're still not holy, if that makes sense. So, and also I think it's interesting, and this comes out, and this really stood out to me, especially at the end of 22, and we might go back and talk about some other things, but just to continue on this thought process. The very end of chapter 22, he's given all these instructions basically to the priests, and at the very end, and starting in verse 31, he says, you are to keep my mitzvot, my commandments, and do them. I am Adonai. You must not profane my holy name, for I will be made holy among Bnei Israel. I am Adonai, who makes you holy, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Adonai. So he says, I am Adonai, who makes you holy. So I think, so it's actually not keeping the commandments that makes you holy. It's the Lord that makes you holy. And so I like the way this is from my favorite Leviticus book, Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord. He says, Israel is called to keep the commandments, but doing them does not make the people holy, but rather prepares them to be made holy by the Lord's presence. So are the commandments necessary, particularly when we're looking at this system and the level of revelation that is present in this period that we're reading about? The commandments, yes, are they necessary? But they, in and of themselves, are they what making the people holy? No. Yes.
Well, we talked last week, this analogy, I think it was last week, the week before, Miguel brought it up, and I love it because I use it also. It's like having a driver's license is the covenant. The covenant is agreed to follow the traffic laws. And so so you see the red light or the stop sign, so you stop. And yeah, maybe your intention is to, well, it's the law, so I just do it. But the ultimate purpose is to love your neighbor.
Yeah.
And And so, I see the commandments as, and this was a big paradigm shift, because, you can be taught that the commandments are bad or they're unkeepable, so you don't do them. But when you see, like Paul said, I can't quote him exactly, but, and the Psalm 119 says, the commandments are beautiful, great. They're very positive, that God gave them to Israel as a blessing, not as a curse.
Exactly.
In order to, like you said, for God to use that tool or that vehicle to have a relationship with him.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you can fall in love with the tools, but yeah, we need to keep, I guess, a focus on what is the purpose of the tool.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Well, the way I understand it is, the commandments help us to cleanse us, just to keep us clean. And then when our temple is clean, now His presence can be in us. Just like you said, He's the only one who makes things holy.
Yeah.
But His presence is there, is holy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's good.
that's the way I understand it.
Yeah. So yeah, and the other thing when you think about this is, so it's like, it's kind of one of those things too, of like the more you're obedient, and this portion is specifically given to the priest, but we think about the commandments throughout the Torah, even throughout the rest of the Bible, throughout the New Testament, thinking of the words of Yeshua and things like that. The more that I would say, the more that you dwell on them and that you seek to obey Him unto being closer to them, the more you become like Him, right? And it's this process of sanctification that, really is what the process of becoming more and more like God, which we have lots of occurrences in, particularly even like through with Yeshua, of like, right, what's their goal is to be more like Yeshua, who is the living, is God made flesh. And so so becoming more like Him is like, I think is another goal or process of holiness. So specifically in these chapters, something that's always really interesting, and I don't know if you talked about it last week, because also it was a double portion, so I don't know where you landed last week necessarily, but one of the things I love about last week's portion is there's a lot of connection specifically in Leviticus 19 to the 10 words. I don't know if you've noticed that. Just reading through it, there's a lot of language that's very similar to the 10 words. And so I didn't bring it, but I have listed out like all the parallels and all the verses that connect from Leviticus 19 back to where the 10 words are given in Exodus. And it's really interesting. It's really fascinating. So I would encourage you to go back and look at some of those if you haven't seen all of that. But then when we get into this week's portion in 21 and 22, it's really kind of fleshing out, like I mentioned at the beginning, like we're in this parallel portion that parallels back to Leviticus 8 and 9, really. And so really like these instructions are kind of, that was the portion in chapter 8 and 9 was kind of the consecration of the priests, and now we have this instruction for how they're to kind of live so that they continue to be consecrated, right? It's not just because everything is a process, and it always makes me think of like thinking about like how things are progressive or how there's more required it makes me think of the verse that talks about salvation being worked out with fear and trembling. It's like our salvation is really not just a moment. It's a life. It's a continual being transformed and conformed to His image and those kinds of things. And so this very much feels like that to me. It's not just the ceremony where the priests are consecrated. It's how they live their lives and how they continue to steward the service in the tabernacle to the Lord. And the other thing is interesting. So the Haftorah portion, which I don't always tie in, and sometimes I don't get to reading, honestly, because I use a somewhat different schedule sometimes to read. But the Haftorah portion on our reading schedule is from Ezekiel 44. So I want to read a couple of these little portions for you, and I just think it's fun when like the same things come up. So the beginning of Leviticus 21 says, Then Adonai said to Moses, Speak to the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, A Kohen is not to allow himself to become unclean for the dead among his people, except for his relatives that are nearest to him, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother, or his virgin sister who is near to him, who has had no husband. For her he may allow himself to become unclean, but he is not to defile himself a husband among his people, and so profane himself. And it goes on to talk about some of the other things that they're not allowed to do, which all ties into basically not profaning the name of God. So because really the priests, right, are like the priestly role, right, is to help steward kind of communication and relationship between God and the people. And so they're really representing the name of the Lord to the people in many senses. And so they can't profane his name. Makes sense, right? Let's see here. And then if we flip to Ezekiel 44, and this is kind of a renewing. I love Ezekiel, and I love this section of Ezekiel because it's really about rebuilding the temple. And in verse, which this ties in some other things we've already talked about too, in verse 23, they will teach my people the difference, is referring to the priests. They will teach my people the difference between the holy and the common, and explain to them the difference between the unclean and the clean. In the lawsuit, they will stand to judge and judge in accordance with my ordinances. They will keep my laws and my statutes in all my moedim and keep my Shabbatot holy. They must not come near a dead person to defile themselves, only for a father, mother, son, daughter, brother, or sister who has had no husband may they defile themselves. After he is cleansed, they will count 7 days for him. On the day he goes into the sanctuary, into the inner courts to minister in the sanctuary, he is to offer his sin offering as a declaration of the Lord. And then it goes on to talk about, and I love this section, it doesn't necessarily specifically tie into what we're reading, but I just really love it. It talks about the inheritance of the priests, because of course the Levites are not given a portion within the land, but it talks about that the Lord is their inheritance, and that they do partake in eating many of the offerings, and the Lord sustains them in that way. And so I really like that section. But anyway, I mean, part of this is almost exactly like what we were talking about, and very much ties into this. And so it's just this whole, like, the Lord is consistent, he doesn't, and it's, he doesn't change what he says and how he wants things to operate. And this section of Ezekiel is very much about cleansing and renewing the temple and to be in its proper service. And so, so these things are important to the Lord. And so it's kind of like I was mentioning earlier, like I think we have to ask the Lord. We don't have this temple system. We don't have a priestly role in the tabernacle, because there is no tabernacle or temple. And so, but it still, I think, points to this idea that it's like the Lord has given us instructions on how to live, and if holiness is about being made like him and being in his presence, then I think it's still important for us to think about it. Okay. So the other thing that comes up, and I don't know if you guys talked about this either. I'm hoping it came up a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
Something that stuck out with me with 21 is where it talks about the Lord and Moses with the defects, like they must not have any defect.
Mm-hmm.
I just find that interesting because I don't remember what book it was, Genesis or Exodus, where I think it was Genesis where God was mad at Moses because he was slow, because Moses didn't want to speak because he was slow of tongue, and God was like, don't you know that I created the blind and the deaf, and so God created all that. But then in here it talks about how they shouldn't go up to the sacrifices or to give the bread.
Yeah, well, but it's specific to the priests.
Okay, specific to the priest.
Because, and this is a hard thing, like, I've had several conversations with people, and people have it's a hard one to wrestle through, and I don't have all the answers for it. But it's not saying that people who have any kind of defect can't come into the presence of the Lord. It's this specific instruction and this specific thing about the priests who are doing ministry in this way, who are part of the sacrificial system in some sense. And it's the best understanding we have is because this is supposed to be a representation of kind of the perfection of creation. And it doesn't mean that the Lord doesn't love those people, like you're saying. Like he, but for these specific roles, they can't have these defects. However, it actually doesn't mean that they're excluded even from their tribe. So they might not be able to perform certain things. So they may not be able to be the ones who are, putting the sacrifice on the altar or tending to the lamps or whatever in the tabernacle itself. But they are still considered priests. Because at the end of 21, after it has talked about what you're mentioning, all these defects that you may not do certain things, we'll start in verse 21. So this is 21:21. None of the offspring of Aaron the Cohen who has the defect should come near the presence of to present the offerings of Adonai made by fire. Since he has a defect, he is not to come near to offer the food of his God. He may eat the food of his God, both from the most holy and the holy, but he is not to approach the curtain or come near the altar because of the defect that is on him. But he's still, because they're like the offerings are like the priests that they eat of them, right? That's kind of their sustenance, that's their inheritance, like we were talking about in those verses in Ezekiel. So they still are partaking in that. They're still the portions that are given to the priests, they're still partaking in that. So in that sense, they're still included. They're just not the ones who are doing the work of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That very much takes care of them.
Yes, exactly.
So it's not just excluding them. It's saying you can't perform this particular task, and also you're still going to be taken care of and participate in these parts of the miracle things. So and I actually think that again, like thinking about what we know of other societies in the ancient world. If you had some of these defects, you're just an outcast from society. You're probably begging on the street, or you're cast out into a different community or whatever. And that's not what's happening. Like Christina's saying, like they're still taken care of. They still have to be cared for and given everything that any other Levite would be. They just don't do these specific tasks. And I think I think we can reasonably say the same would be true of these people in other tribes, even though the other tribes are not performing those duties anyway. It's basically making this statement that's just like, just because you're born with a defect or one of these conditions, medical conditions, whatever, doesn't mean you can't be part of the community and you can't experience the presence of the Lord. And I think, and Yeshua even, not specifically Levites necessarily, but it's like makes me think of like some of the healings and the people that Yeshua interacts with, right? And those people are always restored to society, and part of his goal is to say, no, you've been healed. And many times what he says is, go take your offering and show it to the priest and basically enjoy the presence of the Lord, right? So really, there's a lot of kindness in this. There's a lot of mercy, and there's a lot of, it's just, the Lord is really kind.
But after that, he would say,
go and sin no more. Yes. In the cases where there was sin involved, or he just knows people's hearts sometimes.
Yes.
And there's some interesting ways to look at some of that. But because sometimes these things are about sin and sometimes they're not. Did you have something?
And in all of this, we want to always remember that this is all a shadow of the heavenly and all a foreshadowing of Messiah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Messiah is going to be the perfect priest.
For sure.
Nothing wrong with him.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the age to come, when we're in our glorified bodies, we don't have these conditions either. So,
Or rather, we perfectly live them out.
depending, yes, different thoughts on that. Okay, so the other thing that kind of comes up that's kind of woven through some of these instructions have to do with ritual purity and ritual impurity. Was there any conversation the last couple of weeks about ritual purity? Did Miguel talk about it at all? No? Oh my goodness. Okay, that's okay. I like to talk about it. Okay, so we have with ritual purity, and I've said this many times and I'll continue to say it because our brains have a really hard time making this distinction. Being ritually impure or unclean does not equal sin. So we have kind of three main categories of ritual impurity. And specifically it talks to the priests about some of these things, but there's wider application as well. But so corpses, dead bodies, we read something about that. People who've died, interacting with someone who has died will make you unclean. Various discharges and issues of blood, and what many translations call leprosy, but it's really some kind of skin disease. Debatable of what it actually is, but it's some kind of skin condition. Yeah.
Listen, even though it has nothing to do with sin, it's still part of the definition of holiness.
Yes. Yes, but yes. So if you are unclean because of whatever one of these categories, that means you can't go into the tabernacle space. I'm trying to remember. I think it's maybe like Passover. You can't celebrate the Passover, which is why they instituted the second Passover, and that's a whole other thing. But but I would say that being unclean also doesn't necessarily make you unholy. It does limit where you're allowed to go, but it doesn't mean, because these are many of these things are natural things, like that you wouldn't have any control over necessarily. In some regards, in some ways you do, but that's why there's the instruction to the priests, and of course to the high priest, it's even more strict about like whose funeral you can attend, essentially, which is really hard. But anyway, but it's the way the Lord has set it up, and we can talk more about that later, I guess. But so it doesn't necessarily, while it may be tied to holiness in the sense that you might not be able to enter into the tabernacle or the presence of the Lord, it doesn't make you unholy in that it doesn't make you less than necessarily. Now, the challenge is that sin can be connected to these things, whether it was a sinful act that is part of this, or that there's deception, that you are in a state of being unclean and you're not honest about it, and then you make someone else unclean, and then they go into the presence and they don't know, and all these things, so that can become sinful. But it's actually not the same as sin. And there are debates, and this is actually one of the things that became a distinction and was a major issue in the Second Temple period at the time of Yeshua, because we had two of several of the main groups in Judaism were the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the Pharisees were advocating that you needed to be following all of the purity laws and to be trying to be in a state of ritual cleanliness in the diaspora as much as possible. The Sadducees were like, well, if you're not going into the temple, then it's not that it doesn't matter, it's just that it's not going to impact your life as much if you're not going to the temple anyway. And this was a huge issue of debate in that time. And so, again, because I think they were I think in some ways the Pharisees potentially could have been overemphasizing that being in a state of ritual purity meant that you were more holy, or that you were better than other people, or that you were this, that, and the other. You know, when that's not, I don't think that's what really what the Lord intended that to be. And really, if you think about it and you look at some of these things, many of the issues that make you impure, ritually impure, have to do with death. And if we look at this paradigm of life and death, the tabernacle, its system, it's like interacting with the Lord, coming into the presence of the Lord, is really like the greatest level of fullness of life that you can have on the earth at the time, right? And then if we also think about who Yeshua is, he represents, like, right, he's about life, right? He brings life. That's who God is. And so anything that is kind of carrying this this issue of death basically, it's basically bringing and drawing attention to this idea that you don't bring death into the presence of life, if that makes any sense. I need to come up with a better way to say that, maybe, but it has to do with seeing that contrast and that paradigm. And much of this and a lot of this construct is simply because humanity is not perfect, and we do live in this fallen world, and so there are always going to be things that come up that draw our attention back to that, which again doesn't necessarily mean sin in the same way that common doesn't necessarily mean evil. It's just not holy. It's just ritual impurity is not necessarily sin, though it can be. It's just not purity, or it's not, it's not this state where you can come into the presence of the Lord, because there's something, I would say, maybe tainted by death, which our world is. We live in a world tainted by death, right? And coming into this place where the manifest presence of God is. I think sometimes we need that. We need to see that contrast, right? I think it actually helps us to appreciate the presence of God and to appreciate that he is the giver of life and how good he is when we have those moments where we're just not in a state to be able to be in that, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Although our cleansing process was given to us so we can gain access back into. So.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always a way back. It's only ever really just a period of time, which again, there's something, it's like they say absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? Like if you enjoy the presence of the Lord and then you can't be in it for a bit, when you are able to go back in, you probably appreciate it more and you probably experience that glory at a greater level. So there's something about like, the Lord knows that we need the reminder, like because it becomes familiar, right? Like that's one of the things I always am struck by. I'm like, these people have like the manifest presence of God in their midst, and they're still rebelling, and they're still, especially like when they come out of Egypt, they're like, we want to go back out of Egypt. I'm like, are you kidding me? You just had this great deliverance. You have this pillar of cloud and pillar of fire, and you want to go back. But things become familiar. So we always need something to help us remember how good he really is and how much we actually do want to be in his presence. Yeah.
And it seems like all cultures need this.
Mm-hmm.
They need some kind of celebration. They need something that's set apart from everyday life. Like our brains are wired to just get in the habit of doing something, but then when that habit gets broken, like the 6 days a week of working, and then it's broken where you've got this 24-hour period of not only resting from your daily routine, so it's not just what you don't do, it's what you get to do, which is to really focus on being fellowship with other believers, really focus on what we're doing right now, discussing Torah, really focus on worship. I mean, it's such a, we're called to pray 3 times a day to keep that. For me, that was a big breakthrough for me, because I'd go to work, and I wouldn't even think about God all day because I'm focused on my work. But then to take a break, a prayer, was just amazing. And then Shabbat, I could go on and on about that breakthrough.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really good. That's really good. Okay, I'm gonna move on so that we can get through the whole portion. So the next section of this portion, when we get to Leviticus 23, goes through the feasts. So in some ways, it feels a little bit like it's just kind of like dropped in here. It's like, why are we talking about the feasts now, right? And this is also like when we go back. Actually, I was gonna look something. I forgot. Okay, so and this actually, like, again, going back to this diagram, moves us into the next section again, kind of as we're heading back down the mountain, so to speak. Back into sanctuary laws, which is what parallels to the beginning of Leviticus, which, if you remember, is the section that lays out all the basically all the basic types of sacrifice, and the instructions for what you're to bring and things like that. And if you read through this section about the feast, it's very much about what sacrifices you bring. It's about what takes place in the tabernacle itself during all these festivals. So, and we've mentioned Shabbat many times already today, but if you notice, when it talks about the feast or these appointed times, these Moedim, the very first one to be mentioned is Shabbat. So we have an appointed time every week, which is really pretty fantastic. Yeah. So, and this also connects in with, one of the things that comes to mind about this is, when it comes to Yeshua, is many of God cares a lot about Shabbat, right? It comes up many times in the Torah and throughout the rest of Scripture, right? And it's often when people fall away from keeping Shabbat is when things go badly, and there's often a lot of correction about that and a lot of consequence about that. And when we think about Yeshua and his ministry or his interaction with religious leaders, there's a lot of disputes about Shabbat. And, you know, a lot of that comes down to, there's a lot of, the rabbis have come up with a lot of restriction about Shabbat. And not that the Torah doesn't give, you know, you're to do no regular work. There's certain things you're not supposed to do on Shabbat. That is definitely true and clear. But becoming, I guess I would say, overly legalistic about it, you ruin the heart of it, right? And it's like, because Yeshua's point, right, is that it's meant to help us enjoy the Lord and to enjoy life, really, is the purpose of Shabbat, not to be necessarily, it's not supposed to be just about all this discipline of like, oh, I can't do this long laundry list of things. It's like, but it's because you get to enjoy, feel this feeling of kind of heaven pressing closer to earth, and you get to enjoy this presence of the Lord and this just time with the Lord. So again, going back to if our purpose for how we're observing some of these things isn't connected with wanting to be in his presence, right? We talked about at the beginning that the purpose or the goal of holiness is to be kind of in union and fellowship with the Lord. So if that's not in our hearts as we're obeying all of these things, including the feasts, from Shabbat through all the rest of them, then we've kind of missed the point, and we're not going to be made holy if our hearts aren't really in that place. Yeah.
Actually, just to give a quick testimony surrounding that,
yeah.
It took years and years and years for me to wrestle through that, because I never felt like Shabbat was actually restful. And so I was always interpreting rest as in being lazy and not doing anything, and just not having to connect with anybody, and allowing my introvert part of myself to just be in the presence of the Lord. And so having to come to service and having to either minister or even just come and do a lot of connecting and outputting and outpouring was like so exhausting. So I was wrestling with the Lord, and he's like, Christina, what did I do on Shabbat? And I was like, okay, well, you delighted in your creation. He goes, yeah. And it just like, something happened that my idea of Shabbat resting, like I'm actually now able to rest in delighting and connecting with everybody when I come here. And I'm able to rest in delighting what he's done for me in the week. And since then, like Shabbat has been my favorite thing in the world because I get to stop and delight, right? I think that's the thing that happens when we're not stopping, is that we don't get to delight in what's around us and what the Lord has done and what we have done, and in each other. And so it just keeps us busy and distracted from being able to have that relationship. Whereas of him being able to, he stops and delights in us. Like, and if we can delight in the fact that he delights in us, then we can delight in him. And it's just, it takes the legalism away from the Shabbat and brings us back into his presence. It's really good.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah. Whoever.
She using that word of delight. There's the tradition in Judaism that when you gather on the Shabbat and have a meal together, it's called an oneg. And as I understand, oneg means delight. And so it's this emphasis that that these, all except Yom Kippur, particularly what follows that is Sukkot, and it's like it's rejoicing. You know, it's the days of rejoicing. So these are very positive, very delightful times. But I was joking. It does take work to rest.
It does. It does. You have to be prepared for it also,
so you
right?
have to shift the definition of work means.
Yeah, for sure. Rest means. Yeah, no, for sure. I know. I mean, that's I've had similar thoughts because I'm like my Shabbat Saturdays are full.
Yeah.
Like I do often get a nap in, but you know, but like Shabbat is full, and so yeah, if your idea of like to have Shabbat rest means you need to be laying on the couch doing nothing, then it's not that. But if you think of it like you're saying, that it's to delight in one another, to come with this idea of building up and encouraging one another, getting to hear like what the Lord has been doing, even like praying for healing. You know, the Lord, you know, Yeshua did a lot of healing on Shabbat, which was one of the things that got him in trouble with the leadership because they didn't like that. But like thinking about healing is like it's bringing more wholeness, it's bringing more life, it's bringing more of heaven to earth, really. Faith, did you have something?
Yeah, I was trying to find it. I can't remember. I think it's in Isaiah, but there's actually promises for those who delight in his Shabbats.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's good stuff.
I might just mention, because I don't know what your Bible says, but my Bible uses the word convocation. What the word is convocation? It is gathering together as a community. Yeah. So you can't really do these alone. Exactly.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I like about all this too, is like you're saying, is that it's this holy convocation, it's this gathering, it's this corporate communal reality, and all of the feasts are that way. Like really, I would suggest you can't do any of them alone. They're all meant to be done in community, and that was made more obvious and was easier to maybe implement and understand when the tabernacle is standing, because you bring sacrifices. So if everybody's bringing a sacrifice on this one day, you're probably going to run into someone you know. You're probably going to make new friends. You're probably you're going to be together all day, and so. But I don't think that the reality that we're supposed to do all these things together has changed just because we don't have a tabernacle. I think we're meant to experience it together. And so, I mean, it's one of the things I notice, like if I'm not able to be here on Shabbat or whatever, like I notice that, it's, even if I might try to set the day apart or whatever, wherever I might be, it doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel the same as being with a community of believers. So I think that that's something really important to take away from all this, is that it's better when we do it together. Okay, we have like 10 minutes left, so I want to talk about a few things in chapter 24. So we got these two really interesting pieces here, and let me find something really fast. So the first 9 verses. Okay. So the first 9 verses are about light and bread. So we have these instructions, and both of them are basically, it says that they're continually to be tended to. So the light is to be, the menorahs are to be continually lit and tended to. They're not supposed to go out. And then the bread, these 12 cakes, which do represent the 12 tribes, are to be there, and they are to be there continually as well. So and the bread is kind of changed out every Shabbat, and so there seems to be this connection with Shabbat there as well. And one commentary, I think it might have been, "Who shall ascend the mountain of the Lord?" No, I'm wondering if it was something else, but I think it was that one, was even connecting particularly the bread with Shabbat, and see some of the language is similar. So if we look back at, we'll start where we're at. So in Leviticus 24:8, every Yom Shabbat he is to set it in order, meaning the bread, before Adonai continually. It is an everlasting covenant on behalf of Bnei Israel. And this is one of the things that Aaron and his sons are to eat from. But looking back at Exodus 31, it's talking about, the second half of that chapter is talking about Shabbat. And it's talking about it being a sign throughout generations. And then in verse 16, so Bnei Israel is to keep the Shabbat, to observe the Shabbat throughout their generations as a perpetual or a continual covenant. And so there's kind of this connection between kind of the changing out the bread. And I always think of Yeshua, and what is one of the names, or what are the things that we say about Yeshua? He's the bread of life. So there's this connection with the bread it's this Shabbat. It's also on this Shabbat rhythm. So it seems to have this unique connection with Shabbat, which is kind of cool. So even within, even though there are sacrifices every day, and the menorah is to be lit every day, there are some things that are specific about Shabbat. Of course, there are specific offerings that are brought on Shabbat as well, additional sacrifices and things like that. But even just the bread, like this sustenance, this basic sustenance of life that's being renewed essentially on Shabbat, I think it's a really cool connection. It's this kind of, just renewing, revitalizing, something new is being brought. We say we live from the Shabbat, right? The Shabbat is the end of the week, but it's what fills us up so that we're able to, the overflow of Shabbat is what we live from for the rest of the week, right? So I really like that. Any other comments, thoughts about these first 9 verses of chapter 24? All right. Well, then we get into this interesting section.
Is this the blasphemy one?
It is the blasphemy. So again, interesting that it parallels with back in chapter, I think it's in 10, Leviticus 10, Aaron's sons bringing unauthorized fire into the presence of the Lord. And we mentioned earlier that a lot of the instruction given to Aaron and his sons, to the priests as a whole, were about not profaning the name of the Lord. And then we get this little story dropped in here. And I'll just paraphrase a little bit. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But basically, the son of an Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian, which is interesting. And a fight breaks out between this woman's son and another man. And this son blasphemes the name of the Lord and cursed him. And so I would say this is kind of the opposite reality the negative reality of what you were asking about at the beginning about the sanctification of the name of the Lord. So the opposite of sanctification is cursing. So it's kind of referring to how we regard the name of the Lord is how I understand that. And I don't know Greek. So I have not read the original language in the Lord's Prayer in the New Testament to know. The way I have learned it is, our Father in heaven, sanctified be your name. So it's in some sense that we are sanctifying his name by how we regard him. So this is the opposite of that.
Okay.
So
it's
this
more
is
living your life in such a way that
Yes.
his name is honored.
Yes,
right?
yes, because we are. It's in that prayer. It's kind of how we are regarding him. So this is kind of I would say the negative side, the opposite side of that, and it's cursing his name, blaspheming his name. And so Adonai says to Moses that they are to bring him out and they are to stone him, which feels really extreme to us, right? I'm going to read what he says. I'm going to read what the Lord is saying to Moses specifically, and then we can talk about it. So maybe I will end up reading most of it. Anyway, but verse 13. Then Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Bring the one who cursed out of the camp, and let all who heard him lay their hands on his head and have the entire congregation stone him." So this is significant. This is an important detail. It says those who heard him lay their hands. So it does say the rest of the congregation is a part of it, but those who heard him. So that means there is responsibility on the ones accusing, correct? So keep that in mind. We'll continue. Verse 15, then you will speak to Bnei Israel, saying, whoever curses his God will bear his sin. Whoever blasphemes the name of Adonai must surely be put to death. The whole congregation must stone him, the outsider as well as the native born. When he blasphemes the name is to be put to death. Whoever mortally strikes down any man must surely be put to death. Whoever mortally strikes down an animal is to make restitution life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor as he has done, the same is to be done for him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, just as he has injured someone, so it should be done to him. Whoever kills an animal is to make restitution, but the one who kills a man is to be put to death. You are to have one standard of justice for the outsider as well as the native born, for I am Adonai your God. So that seems like the Lord is using this specific instance to kind of lay out some additional moral code here. But he's saying that, like, if we look at the penalty for cursing or blaspheming the name of the Lord, killing another man, essentially, bear the same consequence, right? In both cases, those are to be put to death. If it's an animal or an injury, there's still restitution to be made, but the consequence is not death. Blaspheming the name of the Lord and killing another man seem to be, if anybody disagrees, you're welcome to, but it seem to be of equal weight before the Lord, right? Does that... I think it could seem like those are unequal because one is just speaking something, right, and the other is actually taking a life. But what does it mean? What does that say to us if the Lord is saying, no, these two things are equal?
It means, in a sense, you're bringing death to his name.
Yeah.
Like you're murdering his name.
Yeah. Which goes to like what Yeshua says, right? Like Yeshua, like one of the things we say about Yeshua, like particularly in like the Sermon on the Mount, like he's elevating really the Torah and saying that like if you even have certain thoughts or speak certain words, it's the same as killing or putting someone to death or whatever. And so I think, it seems consistent with this, right? It's like the name of the Lord is holy. And there's in Jewish tradition, there's great respect for the name. It's why they don't, it's why we say Adonai instead of using the four-letter name of God. There's great respect even for when you write the name or you don't write it, and that's what, or they'll say Hashem or Adonai or whatever. There's a placeholder for the name of God because it carries so much holiness and so much weight. So I think it's hard. Like, we tend to be more casual with names and with things like that. And so I think that we miss that sometimes. But the name of the Lord is meant to kind of kind of like you were saying, it's like invoke honor and respect. And the name, like, you know, it kind of is like, this is kind of, I think, also where this idea of like the fear of the Lord comes from. It's like, he wants to be with us. He wants relationship with us. He is kind. He is merciful. He is, you know, he's so good. And also there are consequences if you curse him, or if you don't live in a way that honors him. Yeah.
I just felt, when I was reading this week, to look up blasphemy and the Hebrew word, and it's really interesting because the word is nakab, and it actually means to pierce, to bore, to curse, or to puncture. And, you know, I thought about Yeshua on the cross. I mean, literally bearing our curses. He's literally being pierced.
Yeah.
And it's the same emotionally and spiritually. If someone actually curses you, we feel we feel it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's a whole lot, I think, in there. And just the other thing is, it's another instance in where the Lord specifically says there shall be the same standard for the alien and the native born.
Right.
Where other places is those who sojourn with you, same standard.
Yeah, and I think that's important too, is like it's saying, you know, the outsider or the alien or whatever your translation says, anyone who's dwelling with Israel and who is kind of aligning themselves with the God of Israel is required to hold to this standard as well. Yeah.
But also, that definition bridges the gap even more, because if a part of the definition of blasphemy is to puncture and pierce, then you are literally murdering with your words.
Right. Yeah, and so, yeah, I mean, it's just, it matters what we say, it matters what we do, and there's serious consequences. So, and then it does say at the end of chapter 24, and this is kind of where we'll end, which is kind of on a not so happy note, but it does say that they carried it out, that they did stone the one who cursed. Now, we oftentimes when there's an instruction given for that the consequence for whatever the situation is to be stoned, oftentimes throughout history we don't have a lot of record of that happening, and part of that is because like it said here, is like the ones who heard it have to do it, and so it does, you know, carry a lot of weight to the one accusing. We can contrast that to the story in John of the woman supposedly caught in adultery. Like, where were the one, you know, the man wasn't brought out with her. It, you know, there seemed to be no firsthand witness there. It's a little hard, like the language is a little vague in some of that, but it's basically, it's not, you know, and that's why part of Yeshua is saying, you know, okay, you who's without sin, cast the first stone and things like that, and it causes everybody to self-reflect and they walk away. So it's not exactly the same as this situation, but it's to make a point of there is a weight of responsibility on the one accusing. Yeah.
When I first read and heard about this respect for the name, in common conversation you say Hashem, you're worshiping music, it's Adonai. I was just amazed because over my lifetime it seemed like all the Bibles, of course I always and still do read Christian Bibles, they always say the Lord in capital letters.
Yeah.
But nowadays, in some circles, it's become kind of a thing to actually say the name. It's kind of like, I know this or something, so I'm going to say it. And I give those people a break that they don't know any better.
Yeah.
Than that you're not to do that.
Yeah. And there's different even schools of thought about some of that, and it's just like, because I don't think that the intention is usually to be irreverent or to be disrespectful to the Lord. I think sometimes it's because there has been an emphasis on the familiarity with the Lord, like he is our friend, like, you know, and that's true. He does want to be close to us, and so I think sometimes like using the name like feels like, oh, he's my close friend or he's my close whatever. and I can understand that, but I do think it also, I mean, but again, it's also like, what makes your, how is like just your own countenance toward him impacted by being intentional about the words that you use, the names that you use or don't use, or things like that. And I think, so there's a lot of factors that kind of play into that too, but it does seem that the name of the Lord is significant, and because he is significant, because we need to honor him and we need to live lives that are honoring and respecting the Lord. So it is time to wrap up. So I'm glad I got to get in one last little portion of Leviticus with all of you. I'll miss you next week, yeah, and then I should be back for a little while after next week. But so I'll just pray, and then we will go to service. So Lord, we just thank you again for your word. We thank you for your instruction and your desire to dwell among us, Lord. We ask that you just continue to teach us how to draw closer to you and how to live our lives more and more in your presence, Lord. We thank you for Shabbat. We thank you for this weekly time to come together and to worship you as a community and to build one another up and to worship your name and experience this pressing closer of heaven to earth, Lord. Hashem Yeshua.